We're going to be in Luke chapter 16 tonight. We don't actually have a lot to cover in chapter 16. It's mainly two large, one's a parable, one's a story, and that's about it. But because of the content, I want to take us down a rather lengthy rabbit trail towards the end. So let's just start out. Luke chapter 16, verse 1. Now Jesus was saying to the disciples, a rich man had a servant manager who was accused of wasting his assets. And when it says wasting his assets, the tense of that word is he didn't just do it once. It was a continual thing. He was doing it over and over again. So he called for him and he asked him, "What's this I hear about you? You can't be my manager any longer. Now give me a report about your management." So the guy's been wasting it, cheating it, whatever. He's about to get fired. What would you do? What would Congress do? Well, if it was Congress, I'd say they'd burn the books and take hammers to the cell phones, right? I know somebody in particular that, they did that. But he couldn't, mainly because they didn't have cell phones, 2,000 years ago. There's a quote that we've already covered in Luke chapter 8 that Jesus talked about in chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. He says, "For nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to light. Therefore, take heed how you hear, for whatever has, to him more will be given, and to whoever does not have, even what he seems to have will be taken away from him." The idea that Jesus talked about back then, and is relevant to this, is even though you think you've hidden it, it's all coming to light eventually. Everybody's going to see it, so you might as well just own up to it. Now, this guy doesn't. In fact, what he was being not faithful with was going to be removed from him. He wasn't doing a good job, and now he's losing his job. So verse 3, then the servant manager told himself, "What should I do? My master is taking my position away from me. I'm not strong enough to plow, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that people will welcome me into their homes when I'm dismissed from my job." He needs some friends to be on a rebound, because apparently this job, not only was he the manager of the money, this was his residence. So if he lost it all, well, he was out on the street. So he called for each of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" The man replied, 100 jars of olive oil. The manager told him, "Get your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Hey, that's a pretty good sale. 50% off? Man, you want to write that anytime you can. Especially when it's 100 jars of olive oil. 100 jars of olive oil is somewhere between 900 to 1,000 gallons of olive oil. It was worth 3 years of wages. And it would take 150 olive trees to make that much oil in a press. This was a lot of money. And when with one swipe of the pen, a year and a half's wages are gone. Can you imagine how happy his boss was then? Verse 7, then he asked another debtor, "How much do you owe?" The man replied, 100 containers of wheat. The manager told him, "Get your bill and write 80. Hey, 20% discount. I buy stuff like that all day, right? Apparently, 100 measures of wheat is about 1,000 bushels. It would take 100 acres of wheat field to make this much wheat. 9 years worth of labor. And 20% of it's gone in an instant. The master praised the dishonest servant manager for being so clever, because worldly people are more clever than enlightened people in dealing with their own. Now, I'm sure the master wasn't happy about this loss. I'd say he was probably pretty angry. But he said, I got to give the guy credit because he was looking out for number one. And when he hits rock bottom, and oh boy, he's going to now, he'll at least have some friends looking out for him. I mean, let's face it, if you gained a year and a half worth of salary, you could probably throw the guy a few coins here or there when they need it. And unfortunately for this man, that poor master lost a lot of money. Verse 9, Jesus says, I'm telling you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they will welcome you into eternal homes. If the world can be clever, how they use their resources, shouldn't believers? Not saying we'd be dishonest, like this guy, but we should be pretty clever. We need to be careful what we do with it. We need to use it wisely. Do you remember the parable of the rich farmer in Luke chapter 12? He had a large surplus, and so what he decided to do is he tore down his barns, he built new barns, he threw all the stuff in the barns, and then he said, all right, now I'm going to retire. I've got enough to live off the rest of my life. I'm just going to enjoy it. And Jesus said back then in that parable, God said, I'm going to call you to account for your life tonight. What was the purpose of that parable back then? It was because the guy wasn't focused on what was happening after this life. He had no care about eternity. And in the same way, Jesus is saying, listen, pay attention, because this isn't it. There's more to this life than what we have in the physical. Start preparing now. Just before we leave this parable, by the way, I want you to notice specifically what Jesus is talking about. He says, make friends with the resources that you have, so what? They will welcome you into eternal homes. What better use of our earthly finances than to use them to bring about people into eternity, into heaven? What a better use of our resources. What a fantastic thing. I mean, some of you might remember the old song that Ray Boltz sang, Thank You. You know, he gets up to heaven in the view of this song, and he says, I'm wandering around, Jesus is taking me around, and somebody taps me on the shoulder. You gave in the missions, and because you gave in the missions, I'm here today. What a better use of our resources. You know, honestly, as I look back at my life, not just because I'm a pastor, but just as I look back at my life, I wish I was able to take a few more with me. One of my best friends, his name is Chris. He's been gone for about 6 or so years now. And I spent more time with him being his friend than I did being his guide. And now he's not around for me to guide anymore. And that one stings. How wonderful eternity will be, sharing with those who have guided me and who I've guided into an eternal reward. It'll be wonderful. It'll be fantastic to be able to spend eternity with those that we have worked together to make it into the kingdom. Boy, that didn't come out right, but you understand what I'm saying. Can't work your way into heaven. I understand that, and that's not what I intended. You know, I would really be glad to go hungry if it meant that out of my hunger, that sacrifice, someone would make it into the kingdom. What little we have here that's so important that those out there shouldn't make it in. Jesus says, use the resources that I've given you today in this earthly life so that you have friends in eternity that are going to welcome you into their eternal homes. What a beautiful thought. Verse 10. Jesus continues and he says, whoever is faithful with very little is also faithful with a lot. And whoever is dishonest with very little is also dishonest with a lot. It's not the amount that the person has that's important. It's the person who has the amount. Because if you're dishonest, if you're unfaithful with a little bit, guess what? If God poured out all kinds of blessings, you won the lottery, whatever it might be, you get a aunt and an uncle, rich uncle that died, whatever. If you were dishonest or unfaithful with a little bit, guess what? You're going to be unfaithful with the large amount too. I've heard people lie to my face over and over again. Well, if I won the lottery, then I'd... No, you wouldn't. You'd go and spend it on your own desires. I can see it in your life now. The issue is not the amount. Oh, if I just had this, or if I just had this, then I would. No, you wouldn't. Don't lie. If you're going to be unfaithful with that much, you're going to be unfaithful with that much. But you know what? If you're going to be faithful with this much, you're also the type of person that will be faithful with this much. God sees you clearly. No sense in lying to him. We will be judged by how faithful we are with the blessings that we have been given today. We're not judged on what we might have down the road. I had a church that I knew of most definitely a different denomination, and all of the leaders, the deacons of that church, were so convinced that they could bring things into existence by their words that they all went out and bought lottery tickets so that they could bless the ministry of the church and pay off the church's note. Instead of actually giving that money towards the church where it was needed, they threw it into the state of Michigan and it was never seen again. If you're faithful with a little, you'll be faithful with a lot. But if you're not faithful with that little, it doesn't matter how much you have, you're not going to be faithful with that either. We are going to be judged on how faithful we have been with what God has given us today. Our excuses are no excuse for us to be unfaithful with what he's given us today. They're not. None of our excuses hold water. He doesn't care about our excuses. He cares about our faithfulness in the position that we're at today. Verse 11. Don't you love it when I talk about money? Which is actually funny because David and I, we were talking on Friday night about money and about hell. And guess what? Two topics this passage brings up. Money and hell. We're going to cover both. Verse 11. So if you haven't been faithful with unrighteous wealth, who will trust you with true wealth? And if you haven't been faithful with what belongs to foreigners, who will give you what is your own? About the only person that could get away with that, his first name starts with Hunter. I won't go much further into that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. If you're not faithful with what you have right now, nobody else is going to give you any more because you're just going to throw it away. Unless your name's Hunter. If God knows how many hairs are on your head on any given day, do you really think you can hide numbers in an accounting book from him? No. He's going to see every last penny that you've had or that you've even dropped on the ground. Do you think squirreling away money dishonestly is going to somehow miss his purview? Not a chance. If you aren't faithful with $10, he isn't going to trust you with 1,000. Verse 13. Moving right along. No servant can serve two masters, because either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be loyal to the one and despise the other. You can't serve both God and wealth. You need to break your addiction to wealth. And that's easy for the pastor to say standing up here when I don't know what your finances are. But to be totally honest, it really doesn't matter what your finances are. Because you can be filthy rich and still be addicted to wealth. And you can be dirt poor and still be addicted to wealth. All that God is caring about in reference to your wealth is how faithful are you being with what he has given you. You know the number one way to break your addiction to wealth? You're going to hate it. It's a little word called tithe. Giving God your first, your best 10%. If you can do that, the rest of the 90 flows pretty well. But if you can't give him 10% of what you have, I don't think the God that you think is God in your life is the God of your life. And by the way, this is not a ploy to have you give towards my ministry. I'm under salary. If someone wrote a check for $500,000 tomorrow, it would not change what I make in one iota. It's not about you giving to my ministry to somehow bless you. No, this is you giving back to God what you owe him. He says that amount of money is mine. Now, truth be told, I don't even believe that the tithe is his. Because I believe that everything that I own is his. And if he told me to give it all up tomorrow, it would be on my shoulders and my requirement to give it all up tomorrow. Because it's all his. 10%, that's the minimum. Beyond that, if he calls me to give more, I'd better be willing. Otherwise, it's disobedience. To him that knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him that is sin. So, if you want to hold to the tithe, that's great, but I'll be honest, I think the scripture calls for us to give more than that. Let's see. Another point to that is, as well, this is not about giving to my ministry. If you are so convinced that I am all about the money and you don't want to give it to here, fine. Give it somewhere else that you're getting ministered from, but you better be giving it somewhere. Because if you're holding it back from God, what do you call a person that holds money back from what they have? A miser? Maybe a Scrooge? Wouldn't it be terrible on Judgment Day for God to look down from his throne and say, where's all my money? You didn't bring it with you? You didn't tag it along? Well, I think it's a little too late by the time we get up there to start throwing it back in him. Verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who love money, they'd been listening to all of this, and they began to ridicule Jesus. Now Jesus is over here talking to his disciples, having a conversation with them. The Pharisees, they're eavesdropping into the conversation, and they start to snickering. And literally, when it says ridicule, it means that they turned their nose up at Jesus. They were like, and they started to openly mock him. Now you would think by now they would have known better, but they didn't apparently. And so Jesus pulls out the verbal shotgun and just turns it on them. Verse 15, so he told them, you to try to justify yourselves in front of people. But God knows your hearts. Because what is highly valued by people is detestable, is abominable, the King James says, to God. Jesus says, you can laugh at me all you want, but I know what's inside your hearts. I know the truth. You can't hide it from me. And by the way, before we start getting happy that Jesus is nailing the Pharisees to the wall, Christians do the same thing they're doing. We put up all kinds of walls. We wear all kinds of masks so that people outside around us don't see who we really are on the inside. But you know what? It doesn't matter how many walls you put up. Doesn't matter how many masks you put up. God sees through it all. And if we're trying to hide it, you ain't putting on a show for him. We can give excuses and reasons why we're right, why we compare better than this person over here or this person over here, but that doesn't mean anything. Because we're comparing ourselves to sinful people. And if nothing else, we can always compare ourselves to Hitler, right? I mean, he's got the bottom of the barrel. Well, I got to be better than somebody. I guess it's Hitler, right? But the problem is, one of these days we are going to be judged, and we're going to be judged according to the holiness of Jesus himself. Folks, we can compare ourselves over here all we want, but when we're comparing our righteousness to that of Jesus, his perfection, we're going to lose out. And the only way we don't is if his blood has covered our sin. We can put on the masks, but we're fooling no one but ourselves. I've said it over and over again, but I'll say it again. The most dangerous words that we can ever speak is, "I'm fine." God knows the truth. Verse 16. Jesus says, "The law and the prophets were fulfilled with John. Since then, the good news about the kingdom of God is being proclaimed, and everyone enters it enthusiastically. However, it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for one stroke of a letter," a tittle, literally from the King James, "in the law to be dropped." A tittle is literally, it looks like a little flare that you would put on a letter. That's it. And Jesus said it would be easier for earth and heaven to poof, be gone than for my words to lose even that little dash. It's from this passage and others like it that I am convinced that every word, every name, every number, even the punctuation, God put there on purpose, and we need to take it seriously. It is an answer for everyday life, for all areas of life. And if we dismiss it, or we call it allegory alone, we have failed. Now, there are allegories in the Bible. I'm not saying there's not. But we need to use them accordingly, how they were written. Verse 18. "Any man who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. And the man who marries another woman divorced from her husband commits adultery." This is a wonderfully difficult issue for today, but Jesus doesn't make it too difficult. He's pretty black and white there. If you don't like it, don't get after me. Take it up with the one that wrote it down. You don't like that statement, take it up with God. All right, now Jesus is going to go into a story talking about the afterlife. Much of what we know about the afterlife comes from this story by Jesus. As we've talked about before, parables are hypotheticals. They are a made-up story to give us an idea of some truth. This is an actual story because he's actually using real names. This really happened. And Jesus gives it to us from outside of time. He pulls back the veil of death just a little bit so we can get a glimpse on the other side what it looks like. So, as we go through this next from 19 till 31, I want you to pay attention to the details that Jesus gives in the story. Now, I came up with 22. I'm sure if you studied more, you could find more. The first time I went through it, I found 13. And then as I studied again for it today, I was like, I think I missed a few, and I'm up to 22 now. We'll probably find more, but we'll just deal with them as we go, okay? Notice again the details. Verse 19. "Once there was a rich man who used to dress in purple," means royalty, "and fine linen, and lived in great luxury every day. The Pharisees had the belief that the more godly you were, the richer you were. If you were godly, like he was talking about earlier, then God obviously can bless you with much more money, and you are filthy rich because you are wonderfully holy." Well, Jesus is going to beat that idea all apart in this story. Your riches aren't a sign of your salvation. And boy, we can look at our nation, one of the richest nations in the world, and we can see that all over the pages. Verse 20. So verse 19, we've got this unnamed rich man who is living life every day in luxury. Verse 20, "A beggar named Lazarus, who was covered with sores, was brought to his gate," the rich man's gate. I find it interesting that the rich man's name would have been known by everybody, but Jesus doesn't give it. But Lazarus, whose name nobody knew and nobody noticed, Jesus gives us that name because Jesus noticed him and Jesus knew who he was. Forget the rich man. Pay attention to this guy, Lazarus. He was always trying to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs used to come and lick his sores. One day, the beggar died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's side. Oh, I just found another one. After we die, we are taken by God's messengers into comfort. That's a good one. That'd be number 23. I told you I'd find more. The rich man also died and was buried. Notice who did not come for him. Anyone, nobody. Verse 23, in the afterlife, and the word there is actually Hades, where he was in constant torment. The word here for torment is a place of torment. It's the same word that they use for torture chamber, or when they put somebody up on the rack. You know how they tie them off and they put them and they pull their bones apart? Yeah, that's the place of torment. That's what the same word here in the Greek. So, in the afterlife, this rich man was in constant torment. He looked up and he saw Abraham far away and Lazarus by his side. So he shouted, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool off my tongue, because I am suffering in this fire." But Abraham said, "My child." You remember Jesus had an argument with the Pharisees, and they said, "Oh no, we're saved because we are children of Abraham." Notice how Abraham refers to this man in verse 25. He said, "My child." Guess what? Not all the children of Abraham are children of Abraham. And not all of them are going to make it. Remember that during your lifetime you received blessings, while Lazarus received hardships. But now he is being comforted here while you suffer. Besides all of this, a wide chasm has been fixed between us, so that those who want to cross from this side to you cannot do so, nor can they cross from your side to us. The rich man said, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, because I have 5 brothers, to warn them, so that they won't end up in this place of torture too." Think about the heart of this unrepentant man. He is in constant torment, and do we see, look at how selfish he is. He still looks at Lazarus as the beggar, his servant. And he's asking Abraham, make Lazarus leave the comfort that he has to go warn my brothers for my benefit. Who does he think he is? You see, when you go into eternal punishment, who you are doesn't change. All of your desires, they're still there, except now they're unfulfilled for eternity. There's no hope of feeling completion, feeling like you got it. If you can't get it here, you're certainly not going to get it there. You know how when you commit sin and you think that it's going to fulfill the desire that you have, once you do the sin, you realize that the desire was just out of reach and you need a little bit more? Same thing in hell, except it's always just out of reach. This selfish man is still trying to get his way. Verse 29, Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." But the rich man replied, "No, Father Abraham." Now he's talking back to Abraham. "But if someone from the dead went to them, they would repent." Then Abraham told him, "If your brothers do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone were to rise from the dead. Now, the reason I believe Jesus used this story, because this poor man's name was Lazarus. And there was a Lazarus, not the same one, but there was a Lazarus that came back to life, that was revived from dead and came back to life. You remember, Lazarus come forth, Lazarus comes out hopping in his grave clothes. They take the grave clothes off and he's alive. What did the Pharisees try to do? Did they, let's investigate his knowledge of the afterlife. Let's see what he has for us. Let's learn from him. No, they tried to shut him up. They realized what he's saying is what Jesus is saying. And if we let him live, he's going to turn everybody towards Jesus. So they plotted to kill him. His brothers weren't going to be changed even if Lazarus showed up on their doorstep and said, listen, I saw your brother down there. They didn't want to change, and they were unwilling to, because they were unwilling to read and listen to the Moses and the prophets. So, let's talk about the details that Jesus gives us of the afterlife in these verses, from verse 19 through 31. In verse 19, 20, and 22, we find out that neither our earthly riches or our lack thereof, our poverty, will follow us into the afterlife. They both either went to punishment or to comfort, completely devoid of any earthly riches. Okay? Next one, Jesus says there is an afterlife. There is something after we live here. If you don't believe that, you don't believe Jesus' words, you got a bigger problem. All right? Also in verse 23, we are recognizable in the afterlife. Now think about this. The rich man recognized Abraham. They didn't have photography back then. How are you going to recognize the guy? The Bible says that in heaven we will be known as we are known. Somehow this rich man knew who Abraham was, knew who Lazarus was. Abraham knew who this rich man was. Knew who his brothers were. We're recognizable in the afterlife. There is a place of constant torment. Again, verse 23, Jesus says so. If you don't believe this, you don't believe Jesus, and you're going to have big problems. Also in verse 23, at least at this time, people could see out of the place of torment. Now, that will change in yet to be future, but at least at this time, in Abraham's bosom, they could see out. Verse 23 also, at an exceedingly far distance, there is a place for the righteous that is apart from the place of torment. Verse 23 as well, the place of constant torment is far below the place for the righteous in direction. Verse 24, we will have bodies in the afterlife. The rich man mentioned that he would ask Lazarus to dip his finger, the tip of his finger, into water and then put it on his tongue. So apparently, if nothing else, we're going to have fingers and tongues. Now, if you go to Revelation, you're going to see a lot more than that, but this is just from this passage. We will have bodies. Verse 23 and 24, we will have feelings and sensations in the afterlife. He was in torment. He was burning. He could feel the burning. Also, Lazarus could feel the comfort. Where there will be feelings and sensations in the afterlife. Verse 24, those who are tormented are still selfish. Also, he gives us a clue that he's in the fire. Verse 24. Also, verse 24, the place of torment is a dry, hot heat. The fire keeps on burning, but it does not annihilate. It would remind you of the bush on Mount Sinai that kept burning but did not burn up. This is the same idea. It is a fire that continues to burn you, but does not annihilate you, does not consume you completely. Verse 25, at least at this time, Abraham could speak to those who were in torment. Again, that will be changed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Verse 25, not all will be in comfort. Specifically here, we mention the children of Abraham. Not all Jews are going to make it in. But Jesus tells us that most will be in torment, where few will actually be in comfort. That's Jesus' own words, not in this story, though. Verse 25, no mercy is given to those who are in torment, not even a drop of water on the burning tongue. No mercy is given to those who are in torment. Verse 25. Verse 26. There is an impassable gulf between the tormented and the comforted. They can't pass back and forth between each other. Also in verse 26, those in torment cannot cross over to comfort or vice versa. You can't leave comfort, you can't leave torment. Catholics understand purgatory is false by Jesus' words. You're not going to work it off. You're not going to get paid out of it. You're not going to be there for some short time. No, you are there perpetually. Verse 28, the place of torment is a place to be avoided. He said, listen, send Lazarus so my brothers don't show up here. He doesn't say, get me out of this thing. He knows he can't. But he wants his brothers to miss this place. It is a place to be avoided. It's not going to be a big old party with all your friends. Verse 29. We should listen to the scriptures because they're true. Abraham says that in verse 29. Also in verse 29, the scriptures reveal how to avoid the place of torment. Miracles alone are not sufficient for the people to believe, even resurrection. Verse 31. The scriptures persuade people to avoid the place of torment in the afterlife as well in verse 31. So those are the 22 plus the one that I saw earlier. You can go back to the passage. You can see all of those come out. This is a lot of detail in a short story like this. We're talking about, what, 12 verses? And Jesus gives us so many details that we can understand what the afterlife is about. Now, for our, I'll say closing, but it's going to be more of a rabbit trail. I'd like to talk about the differences that we find, you can go to the next one, about hell. We are very general when we talk about hell and heaven. It's very generalized. It's very bad spiritually. Because there's a lot more than just simply hell. There's a lot more than just simply heaven. Our words are very broad, umbrella, if you want to call it that. But the scripture is actually very specific. And we need to understand the difference. The grave is translated 31 times, but it's a poor translation because Sheol is translated to grave and grave is translated to grave. Grave, notice up at the top, that's where your tombstone's at. That's the destination of the body. The rich man, he died and they threw him in a cave somewhere. Okay? At one point, all of us are going to have a gravestone over our head unless we are somehow, unless the Lord comes back for a rapture. Okay? It's the destination of the body. The word is actually kiver, and it is in contrast to Sheol, which is to bury. And Sheol is singular, where the grave is plural, because, you walk into a graveyard, right? There's lots of graves. It can be plural. In the Old Testament, it's used 65 times. It means to demand or to ask. Proverbs chapter 30, verses 15 and 16 tells us, it is always hungry for more, and it's never satisfied. The grave is always wanting. It's insatiable, as it were. A grave is a location, a specific site. Sheol, in contrast, is never localized to a specific place. It is accessible at death, no matter the location of death. In fact, no grave is necessary to go to Sheol. So the idea, the difference, Sheol, or Hades in the Greek, is just where you go when you die. It's not a specific place. I could be in Michigan, I could be in Kentucky, I could be Tennessee, Florida, die, and I will go to Sheol. I will go to the afterlife. I will go to Hades. Okay? We'll all make it there. If I get burnt up and there's not a piece of me left except flakes, I will still go to that place. Alternatively, any one of those different places, I will go to a specific grave where I die. We haven't decided where my plot's going to be yet. I dare say my wife's going to probably try and shoot me off into the atmosphere somewhere. Set me off in a rocket. Which wouldn't matter to me because, well, I'm in Hades. It doesn't matter where I go. It's in the afterlife. The first occurrence is Genesis chapter 37, verse 35. And this is when Jacob realizes or understands from his sons that Joseph has died. He believes that Joseph is in Hades, but that he is who he is, and one of these days he will be with his son. And all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "For I shall go down into the grave," which is Sheol, "to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. It couldn't mean grave as we think of with tombstone, because his son was eaten up by a wild animal, or so he thought. The idea was he was going somewhere else, the abode of the dead. Also notice from that passage, verse 35, that you go down to the grave. So let's talk about Sheol. Sheol is the same as Hades in the Greek. It's under the earth, underworld, lower parts of the earth. It's the deepest parts of the earth, the scripture tells us. It's the location of departed souls and the abode of the dead, both good and bad. It is the opposite of heaven. Psalm 139, verse 8, "If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell," Sheol, "behold, you are there." Both good and bad, God's in both. The inhabitants of Sheol are the congregation of the dead, Proverbs 21, verse 16. Sheol and Hades receive both good and bad individuals. It was Abraham's bosom or paradise, like we just talked about in the story that Jesus gave for the righteous. It was the place of perpetual torment for the wicked, also in the story that we just read. Hades is evacuated upon Jesus' resurrection, Ephesians chapter 4, verses 8 through 10. Jesus the Messiah was the first fruits of the ones who had died trusting him, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. For the believers absent from the body in this life is to be in God's presence, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. So the idea is Sheol, Hades, is not the place of hell for all bad people. It is both good and bad. It's where we are going to abruptly go, absent of life. We will be either in the presence of Lord or in the presence of perpetual torment. That is Sheol. Under Sheol is a place called Tartarus. By the way, you can see the place of torment on the left, Abraham's bosom and paradise on the right. In between, there's a massive gulf. Below that is this place called Tartarus in the Greek. It's also Abuso, or the abyss, the bottomless pit. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down into, we have it translated hell, but it's actually Tartarus, the bottomless pit, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. The idea that Tartarus is this massive hole. And what the scripture tells us, it was one of the first fathers. He said that Tartarus is as deep as heaven is as high. So you get thrown into the bottomless pit, you just keep going down. Where if you go to heaven, you just keep going up is the idea. That's what he said. So now let's talk about the bad place. Let's talk about Gehenna. It was originally named for the Valley of Hinnom. We've talked about that in the past. Below the temple, where the temple resided, there's a valley. There's a valley on the one side called the Kidron Valley. There is the Tyropian Valley, and then in between those two places, on the bottom side, is the Hinnom Valley. This was the garbage place. This is where people took their garbage to be burned. But during the times when Israel was turning from God, it's where they worshiped the other gods, including Molech, the brass god that was set up where they would set their children on him being red hot and fry their children alive. This place was, they would beat drums loudly in their worship ceremonies. It was a place of evil. It was a place that was awful. Josiah ended up coming and cleaning it all out, but not until many children had died there. It was a terrible place. It was a place of constant burning, and it became synonymous with all of the bad, all of the idol worship. If you're going to worship all those terrible idols, this is the evil, awful place that you're going to go. It's also, Gehenna is also known as the lake of fire. It's known as the second death and eternal punishment. Gehenna in the afterlife was prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew chapter 25 verse 41, then he will also say to those that are on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. The world tells us that Satan is the ruler of Gehenna or hell, but it's the furthest thing from it. Satan will actually be more tormented than any other being in Gehenna. Only Satan rules in this life, in this hell. And if you're a believer, this is the greatest hell that you're ever going to face. Does that make sense? Worst that you can absolutely have in this life is the worst that you will ever get. But the greatest reward or ruling that Satan will ever have is what he has right now. Because when the afterlife comes, he will be more tormented in the deepest parts of Gehenna than any other being. Revelation chapter 20 verse 14, then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire, into Gehenna. This is the second death. Jesus mentions this place 11 of 12 occurrences in the New Testament. Jesus talks about it a lot. And he always uses it as an idiom or mental image of the ultimate place of the unrepentant. So I want to just take you through a couple verses. Matthew 10:28, do not fear those who can kill the body but can kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Matthew 18, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into everlasting, everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into Gehenna's fire. Matthew 23:15, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much the son of Gehenna as yourselves. Matthew 23:33, serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of Gehenna? And then lastly, Mark chapter 9, verse 43. If your hand causes you to sin, as we read earlier, it is better for you to enter life maimed rather than having 2 hands and go into Gehenna, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. He says it twice. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame, rather than having 2 feet and cast into Gehenna, into the fire that is never quenched, where the worm never dies and the fire is never quenched. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, for it is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into Gehenna's fire, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. From these passages, we understand that Gehenna is a place of fire. It's a place for those who are under judgment. For those that are condemned, it is a place to be avoided at all cost. It is perpetual fire, always burning. Jesus says 3 times the worm doesn't die. A decay that is always gnawing at the soul. Pride, self-will, desire, malice, envy, shame, sorrow, despair, all of them are never satisfied in Gehenna. Think about that. You want a hamburger. You know, we get the desire for a hamburger up here. Forgive me for making light of this. You just, man, I just like a Big Mac. I don't know why you'd ever would, but I have that desire to have a Big Mac. And you get that gnawing feeling, that'd be good. In hell, whatever the gnawing feeling is, it is never quenched. It's always wanting it and never fulfilling it. What a terrible place. 3 different times Jesus says that the fire is not quenched. It is a place of perpetual burning, and it is never weakened. So lastly, and this is for the close, is the punishment of hell eternal? Matthew 25:31. When the Son of Man comes into his glory, and all of the angels are with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All of the nations will be assembled in front of him, and he will cut them out one from another, like a shepherd separates sheep from goats. He will put the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left. Then he will say to those on his left, verse 41, "Get away from me, you who are accursed, into eternal fire." Guess what that word eternal means? Perpetual, never ending. That has been prepared for the devil and his angels. Here's why. I was hungry and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. I was naked and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison and you did not visit me. Verse 44, then they will reply, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't help you? Then he will say to them, I tell you, all of you, with certainty, since you didn't do it for one of the least important of these, you didn't do it for me. These people will go away into, again, eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life. By the way, the passage that we read earlier for Luke 16, the story of Lazarus and the rich man, the context of the rich man going to hell, going to Gehenna, is because not that he somehow maligned or sinned against Lazarus in doing anything. Jesus implies he was in hell because he did nothing. He didn't do anything for Lazarus, and that was his reason and position for being there. The word is eternal. There is a massive growing movement that will say hell is not eternal. If Satan was trying to lead people to hell, what do you think he might tell them? Oh, you'll just spend a little while there. Some say you cease to exist, like the Jehovah's Witness, but that doesn't explain, either one of them, why Jesus calls it eternal over and over again. It is not a short period. If it were, that means heaven would also be a short period because the words are both eternal. Eternal loss, eternal gain, wouldn't be for very long. If we think we fail to understand how much God hates sin and rebellion, if we think it's just going to be a short time, we have no comprehension about how much God hates sin. The extremity of God's hatred for sins and towards it is seen in how abused his son was at his death. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 10, it pleased the Lord to strike him. Adultery, horoscopes, and even disrespectful children. Where's the other one? Yeah, way back in the back. There she is. And even disrespectful children in the Old Testament were all capital punishment crimes. Adam and Eve were cast from the tree of life that they might not live forever in the state of being lost, eating a piece of fruit. It only takes one sin, one smack in the face of God. It is a permanent, perpetual punishment. We are so callous to our sin, we think, oh, God just doesn't think that much of it. It's no big deal. John MacArthur, who I rarely quote, says about the only sin that we still hold as capital punishment in our day is extreme abuse against children. And what are we doing now? We're willing to change their sex and identity, which I would say is pretty criminal in and of itself. All sin is rebellion. It's shaking our fist in the face of God. I did it my way, like I mentioned on Sunday morning. I guarantee you Frank Sinatra is regretting that song. Back when Sonia and I were in our sophomore year, we took American history class, and our teacher, his name was Mr. Mills. And we were talking about the Great Depression and how it happened. And so one of the things that he did for us is he made a contest for all of us students in the class. And he gave us a fake amount of money that we could invest in the stock market. And in the stock market, we were to see how it went at the end of the semester. Whoever had the most gain was the winner. I loved it. I've always been competitive anyway. So nearly every day, I actually put I don't know why I know this after 25 years, but I remember that I took all of that stock and I put it all into Merck, which was a smaller company back then and has exploded now because it's all into pharmaceuticals. I did well. I did great. And every week I'd check and make sure, man, I'm beating everybody else. The problem was, Mr. Mills, even at Mount Carmel, didn't think to put restrictions on the stock of choice. And I was doing really well in comparison to a lot of my students or my classmates. But there was one student that he topped us all. His name was Chris Richmond. Funny thing was, he was actually a faculty student. He decided to take all of the stock money that he had and he put it into a company called Playboy. The stock split 3 times, and he would have been a millionaire by the time it was all said and done. A few weeks into finding this out, how well his stock was doing, we never heard from Mr. Mills about our stocks again. Yeah, that went away. He didn't want to admit how well Chris did on that stock. But man, even for fake money, I wanted to know. I was invested. I'd go to the newspaper. That's a little piece of paper for you kids that have writing on it that they would put out frequently. I would look every week, and it was over fake money. In recent years, I went in and I bought into Bitcoin. I had a couple hundred extra dollars at one point, and I threw it in Bitcoin because Bitcoin was doing well. And I'd check on my phone every day to see how my Bitcoin was doing because I was waiting for it to spike, and I was going to sell high and then wait for it to drop and buy it low again. Well, it never did anything. I checked it every single day, and by the end of it, I sold out and lost just a little bit of money by the time you pay taxes on it. But even though it was a couple $100, I focused on it every single day. I checked my phone. I did it religiously. If I was willing to do that over a couple $100, why don't I pay more attention to eternal matters? That they're eternal. Maybe it's because our hearts aren't in it. Maybe it's because our treasures aren't there. Maybe it's because we haven't been investing anything over there to worry about the return. I dare say if we were honest with ourselves, we'd pay a whole lot more attention to the minuscule things that will rust, that will rot away, that will be gone, and could be gone in minutes, than what we do that will last for eternity. I don't have adequate words enough, nor are our minds capable of comprehending the severity of even the first moments of torment that awaits us upon our entrance into hell, much less of its perpetual state for eternity. I don't have the ability. We are all investing somewhere in eternity. We'd better be very careful that wherever we are investing pays off in a big way and for our benefit, because the alternative will be hell. Let's pray. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists
and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.